Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on June 10th, 2024. Today it's my great pleasure to be joined by Ali Abunimah. Ali is a Chicago-based Palestinian-American journalist and a co-founder of Electronic Intifada. Electronic Intifada is a nonprofit online media outlet that covers the Palestinian struggle from a Palestinian perspective. It was established in 2001. Ali is the author of a book entitled One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse, which proposes one state in historic Palestine shared by two peoples. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ali.
Thank you, Dimitri. It's my pleasure.
Nowadays, Ali, it takes considerable courage to include the word intifada in the name of a U.S.-based news organization covering the struggle of the Palestinian people. And during these past 8 months of genocide, I've followed the coverage of EI very carefully, and compared to other Western-based media outlets, I found, and I'm including in that, by the way, independent media outlets, not just the morally bankrupt corporate media outlets. I have found EI's coverage has been unique in several respects, and one of the ways in which it seems to me to be unique is that it provides regular in-depth analysis of the combat in Gaza, focusing on the tactics and battles from the perspective of Palestinian armed resistance. Of course, much of that analysis is being given by John Elmer, but also you've participated in other members of your team. And I found that as someone who's paid very careful attention to the military aspects of what is happening in West Asia, that it's really high quality analysis that's being provided on a consistent basis. But I'm curious to know why your organization decided to focus on combat in Gaza when so many other organizations are ignoring it, at least from the Palestinian perspective.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'm very proud of the work we're doing, and I'm very proud of my colleagues, and I'm proud first and foremost of our colleagues, our writers, our contributors, our photographers, our videographers in Gaza, who have continued to work throughout this genocide. And I think that they are creating, and we're privileged to be a platform for a unique collection of testimonies, first-hand testimonies of this genocide, which will ensure that no one can ever say we didn't know or we weren't aware of what was going on. It's all there, and we're very proud to do that. In terms of the military analysis, it's a major part of what's going on, and you can't understand any of the political developments without understanding the military analysis. The fact that people all around the world are talking about Gaza, the fact that Israel is being isolated, that we're starting to see the ICC issuing warrants for the arrests of Israeli leaders, the fact that we're seeing countries, for better or worse, recognizing the state of Palestine, is due to the acts of the resistance on the ground. No one would be talking about Palestine if the resistance weren't there, if they hadn't denied the Israeli army any kind of victory for these past 8 months. And John Elmer, our colleague, we're very fortunate that he has this tremendous expertise. And what he does is he applies that to, among other things, but principally to the videos that the resistance groups themselves are releasing, and that are a unique real-time record of what's happening on the ground. Acts that I think many of us, even myself, wouldn't believe if I couldn't see them. Acts of astonishing bravery, walking right up to tanks and attaching mines to them, complex ambushes against the most heavily armed, best funded army in the region, backed by the United States and Canada and the UK and Germany and so on. And these guys who are under siege in Gaza have developed military tactics that are capable of defeating this army in battle. When I say defeating it, I mean that literally. Israel is defeated in Gaza militarily. Now, we don't count murdering, exterminating men, women, and children as a military victory or achievement on behalf of Israel, because that's no achievement. That's not something anyone could be proud about, and it takes no skill. But in terms of actual combat, Israel has been thoroughly defeated, and the world needs to see it. And the analysis that we provide, you get quite a bit of that kind of analysis in Arabic language media, but almost none in the English language. And so it's important to us to make it accessible to the world.
I very much want to come back to the subject of the strategic and military defeat. This also, I think, an economic defeat that Israel is in the process of suffering, but we'll come back to that a little later. For now, I want to stay on the subject of the resistance. During the past week, EI interviewed Helena Coban. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She's a British-American international relations expert who has focused her work on West Asia, and she has a deep knowledge of Hamas. And she reports that she's interviewed its leaders on numerous occasions. And one of the themes of your discussion with Coban was the Western left's approach, or what we might call the liberal class, the progressives, their approach to Hamas. And I understood both you and Coban to be critical of the Western left's approach to Hamas. And in fact, this was a theme you developed in a June 2021 article titled "It's Time to Change Liberal Discourse About Hamas." And how, in your view, briefly stated, Ali, do you think the Western left has erred in its approach to this resistance organization? What did you think is the approach that it should have been taking up until now?
Well, you often hear liberal or even progressive or even leftist people saying, of course I condemn Hamas, but of course I condemn what Hamas did, but. So they want to provide this liberal cover to whatever criticism they're going to make of Israel. And tactically speaking, that makes no sense, because nothing you're going to say is going to appease Israel's supporters. It's not like they're going to say, oh, you condemned Hamas and therefore we're going to now take seriously what you say in criticism of Israel. So it's a rhetorical device, but it's one that also reveals a very dismissive and superficial understanding of Palestine, of the struggle. And it harkens back to, every single liberation struggle, every single one in the modern period. Those who have been on the front lines of the struggle, fighting the bayonets and the cannons and the gunboats of the imperialists, of the colonizers, have been demonized as terrorists, have been demonized as extremists, as radicals, as people who are beyond the pale. And so it's very disturbing to see people on the left doing that. And it's an easy out to say, well, to get around the fact that Palestinians have chosen armed struggle because they have no other means to fight for their right and their existence, because writing op-eds in the Toronto Star or the New York Times hasn't done it. The BDS movement has made tremendous progress in the last 15, 20 years, but that hasn't been enough to change the discourse or the power configuration that sustains Zionism. And the work I've been doing, maybe it's made a small contribution over the years, me and my colleagues, but that's not going to be enough. Ultimately, what it takes is the resistance. So being open about that, saying armed struggle is a right that people have. And it's certainly appropriate in this setting for Palestinians to use armed struggle. And you can contrast, of course, not everyone on the left, but a large part when it comes to Ukraine, did not have any of these qualms. Everyone was willing to say Ukrainians have a right to armed resistance or struggle, no matter how you conceive of the situation there. That part wasn't controversial on the left. And then when you pointed out that actually, these aren't anti-imperialists, they are tools of imperialism, the people who are being armed in Ukraine, and in many cases Nazis. When you talk about Azov and others, people say, well, okay, well, they're not perfect, but their country has been invaded and they have a right to struggle. So people are willing to make all sorts of excuses for the fact that, these were Nazi, self-identified as Nazis. Whereas when it comes to Hamas or uh, Islamic or Islamist movements, people are much less willing to do that. And they say, oh, well, but, they start bringing up all sorts of things about, uh, we can't make, as leftists, we can't make common cause with people who would be described as Islamists. But you didn't have those qualms about Nazis. Of course, I'm absolutely not comparing the two in any way. Nazis are unambiguously bad, whereas Hamas is a mainstream nationalist Islamist movement within Palestinian society, and with views that are far more moderate than most people imagine. Again, you have to get away from this caricature view, which is being pushed by so many on the left, even of extremism, of radicalism, of this sort of thing. When the reality is that Hamas sits very much within the Palestinian nationalist mainstream. So another fallacy is to say that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinian people. To a large part, it does represent the Palestinian people as a resistance movement. That doesn't mean that every Palestinian agrees with every aspect of Hamas's political or social views, but as a resistance movement, they do pretty much represent Palestinians. That's not to say there aren't some who would be aligned with the anti-resistance forces of the Palestinian Authority and so on, but they have a broad legitimacy as a resistance, broad and deep legitimacy as a resistance movement, and it is that has to be just said and admitted and acknowledged openly. It's nothing to be shy about.
I believe Helena Coben pointed out in her discussion with you that there were two polls done, I believe it was December and March, during this genocide in occupied Palestine, which reflected, correct me if I'm wrong, Ali, that both in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, a substantial majority of the population approve of Hamas. And I believe in the West Bank that the support level actually increased between those 2 months, despite the absolute horrors that Israel is inflicting upon Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and to a lesser extent in the West Bank. Is that correct, that the most recent polling shows significant majority support for Hamas despite all the horror that the Palestinian people have endured since October 7th?
Yes, and to the extent that we can take those polls as accurate, because it's obviously very problematic to poll in these circumstances in Gaza. But polls are not the only indicators we have. I mean, a resistance movement like this cannot survive, cannot thrive without broad support of the population. And it's clear that the resistance, which is the largest segment of that, is Hamas, but that's not the only group. There's Palestinian Islamic Jihad, there's the leftist groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and others have broad support within Palestinian society. Inside Palestine and in the diaspora, people support resistance, which is their right, I know that, support can mean all sorts of things. That doesn't mean people are sending weapons. Nobody can do that because of, it's utterly criminalized, but you're still allowed to have an opinion, and people support resistance, and they have a right to do that because it is right to support resistance against an evil, a genocidal evil such as Zionism. And that's what it is. And any people in similar circumstances would resist and would be celebrated for their resistance. They would be celebrated. Palestinians in a unique position where they're demonized for their resistance. Of course, well, when I say unique, I mean in contemporary times, but historically, every resistance movement, every anti-colonial struggle is demonized. The ANC, famously, I mean, when Nelson Mandela passed away a few years ago, and all those Western leaders went to take selfies at his funeral, these were, in many cases, either the same leaders, or they were members of the parties, or they were, in the same political tradition of the leaders of an earlier generation who had declared Nelson Mandela to be a terrorist, who had declared the ANC to be terrorists, who had endorsed South Africa's refusal to negotiate with the ANC. Of course, they want to whitewash that afterwards and say, yes, of course, we always supported Nelson Mandela. It's not true. You considered him a terrorist. You outlawed support for the ANC as a terrorist group until just a few years ago, Nelson Mandela was still considered a terrorist by the United States. Long after he became president of South Africa and left that position, he was still considered a terrorist by the United States. So these, again, we have to place this discussion in this historic context. People are always unwilling to touch the demonized group at the time, whereas in hindsight, they say, well, of course, that was wrong, and we should have seen these people as freedom fighters. And that's what's going on now. People are struggling against this Israeli genocide, not because they're Hamas or not, or something else, but because this is a just struggle, and Hamas is organizing the fight against this genocide along with the other factions. And that's just the reality. I don't want to sit here and give you, all sorts of caveats.
Mhm.
The resistance is a legitimate, absolute, it is a righteous struggle against a great evil.
I want to take advantage of your reference to the Ukraine conflict because I have a personal beef with the left on this particular score. Very early on in the Ukraine war, I was one of the few people who has anything of a political profile in Canada who was vigorously opposing the transfer of arms to the Ukrainian government. And I would say that even if we ignore the overwhelming evidence of the infiltration of openly neo-Nazi groups into the Ukrainian military and security services, there's still plenty of reasons not to arm the Ukrainian government. One of them being that as we're seeing in horrifying real time, this is not a war that Ukraine can win no matter how much weaponry we give. They have virtually no men left to bully and conscript into their army. Secondarily, Russia does have legitimate complaints. For example, it is in fact a matter of historical record that the West promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. There's a mountain of evidence of that in the George Washington University archives, for example. This is a corrupt government. And also there was the risk of this escalating to a nuclear war, amongst other reasons. So I was saying these things publicly in 2022. And people whom I know to be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause were castigating me. I lost friends. I was openly chastised and sometimes vilified as a Kremlin agent and a Putin apologist by people who had formerly been supportive of me. And I must tell you, Ali, and any of you listening now, I want to say to you that your hypocrisy is boundless and grotesque, because I have not heard a single one of you argue that we should be sending weapons to the Palestinian people. You were all too comfortable to join in the warmongering and demand relentlessly that we continuously escalate this war and provide whatever weaponry Zelensky demanded, but not a peep about defending the Palestinian cause with arms shipments, even though what they're enduring is far worse. And it's been going on far longer than what the Ukrainian people have endured in the last 2.5 years. So I just want to get that off my chest. Now, I want to go back to this question of Mandela. You also talked about Mandela, and you mentioned him in your article of 2021, the one that was entitled, "It's Time to Change Liberal Discourse About Hamas." And you wrote this: Nelson Mandela, now treated as a saint by Western political leaders who support Israel's massacres of Palestinians and condemn Palestinian resistance, explains this in his autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom. Quote, "It is always the oppressor, not the oppressed, who dictates the form of the struggle. If the oppressor uses violence, the oppressed have no alternative but to respond violently. In our case, it was a legitimate form of self-defense." This sentence I found very striking from your article. Mandela is quoted as saying, "It is up to you, not us, to renounce violence," Mandela recalls telling the apartheid regime. Now, there is in the dungeons of the apartheid regime with which the Palestinian people are dealing, a man by the name of Marwan Barghouti, and he is sometimes referred to, I understand, as the Palestinian Mandela. You hear hardly anything about him in the West. They've tried to bury him in the dungeons of history. Those of us who care about the Palestinian cause know about Barghouti, but certainly you rarely hear him mentioned in the mainstream press. He's serving, I think, 5 life sentences for what are alleged to have been acts of terrorism perpetrated against Israeli civilians. What can you tell us about Marwan Barghouti? He seems to be somewhere a kind of a unifying figure. He's neither Hamas, neither, shall we say, Fatah in a sectarian sense. He clearly believes, my sense is, in armed resistance. What should we know about Marwan Barghouti, and why do you think the Israelis have kept him alive all this time? Surely they could have killed him if they wanted to.
That's a good question. Of course, he is one of thousands of Palestinian political prisoners and prisoners of war in Israel's dungeons, and they should all be released with question. They should that's the context in which we need to see that he is a prisoner of war. He is a political prisoner, and that's what Palestinians are fighting for. They're fighting for the freedom of their, the centrality of the struggle for the freedom of the prisoners in Palestine is something that I think is not well appreciated outside. I think, having said that, Marwan Barghouti is something of an avatar on which people project what they want to. So I often hear this phrase, he's the Palestinian Mandela, but I don't hear it very often from Palestinians. So I think it's something that people outside Palestine project onto him. I think different people project different things onto him. For some on the Israeli, of course, we can't say left because there's no such thing as a left in Israel, really. But say the liberal-ish wing of Zionism, to the extent that that still exists, Marwan Barghouti is seen as someone who they think has the street cred to impose on Palestinians the type of agreement that liberal Zionists dream of, sort of a two-state solution with a very limited Palestinian state, that they think he has the legitimacy to do that because he is this figure who's been in prison and so that's why you'll sometimes hear, not so much in recent times, of course, but over the years you've heard liberal Zionists saying, oh, we should release Marwan Barghouti. They want to see him as a partner who will give them what they want and who will have the strength, credibility to impose it on Palestinians. And then among Palestinians, I think he gets a great deal of respect as someone who is in prison, who is someone who is who's paid the price, paying a price. And because we never hear from him, he's someone who is not free to speak being in Israeli prison. Again, people project their views on him. They want to, and that's what makes him a unifying figure, and sometimes polls show that. But that's all to say, I think we have to be very careful about what we project onto a man that we rarely have the opportunity to hear from. But it is significant that I think Hamas, in its negotiation stance, has said that they want him released. They're putting him, a non-member of Hamas, sort of at the head of the list of people they want released, which again, and there are reports which I think are very credible that Mahmoud Abbas and the collaborationist traitor regime, the Palestinian Authority, does not want him released because they fear sort of the popularity and credibility he would have as a unifying figure then to challenge them. But the reality is we don't know very much about what he might do or what he might stand for because he is in prison, and until he is released, and that can't be soon enough for him and for all the political prisoners, we won't really know.
I'd like to talk to you now about the so-called ceasefire negotiations, these tortuous on again and off again, communications through intermediaries, that have been going on for virtually the entire time that this genocide has been unfolding. And my own view, Ali, and I know you talked about this with Elena, is that I believe that I don't know what other interpretation one could rationally draw from the behavior of the Biden administration, but that it wants this genocide to happen. My sense is, and of course I could be completely wrong, is that they view the Palestinian people as an incessant irritation. They won't go away. They won't cooperate with the destruction of their own people. And the political elite in the United States, partly for ideological reasons and partly purely for hegemonic aspirations, wants to have complete control of historic Palestine. It's not difficult to understand why. When you look at a map and you see how small Israel is, and then you see there are certain natural barriers from which it can derive protection, like the Litani River in South Lebanon, the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and so forth. I think that they would love just to obliterate the Palestinian people, have done with this, and through their proxy, Israel, expand what is in effect a gigantic U.S. military base in this oil-rich region, and secure it once and for all. But of course, there's an election looming. And Biden is in real trouble, in part because large swaths of his base are completely appalled at the way he's supporting this genocide. And I think there's a personal element to this for Biden and his crew. It's not just that they want to retain power. That surely is a motivating factor for them. But I think that they are anticipating that if they lose, Trump is going to wreak revenge. And they are vulnerable because of, for example, Hunter Biden's dealings with this Ukrainian energy company, Burisma, and other credible allegations of corruption, which have never been fully explored. They might actually end up in jail. So I think that they're torn between wanting the genocide to be consummated and winning an election. And so what they're engaged in, from my perspective, is this elaborate kabuki theater, where they're trying to persuade their base that they actually care about the Palestinian people and they're trying to do something to help them. But in fact, they are prolonging this for as long as possible until ultimately Gaza, at a bare minimum, has been ethnically cleansed. Is that your read of what is going on? Do you think I've missed the boat on this one? What is your best sense of what the real intentions and objectives are in these so-called ceasefire negotiations, principally from the Biden administration?
I think their main intent and objective is to absolve themselves of the genocide, to say, look how hard we're working to get a ceasefire. And I think to a certain extent, they do want a ceasefire because it is just, it is a catastrophe, not just for, well, obviously, first and foremost for Palestinians, which they don't care about, but it's a catastrophe from their perspective. They think of it as a catastrophe for Israel. Biden said it in the speech that he gave, where he laid out the ceasefire agreement. Let me see if I can pull up that text and even read you the sentence, which I think is so key in terms of just understanding how he sees it for the United States from the U.S. perspective. He said, indefinite war in pursuit of an unidentified notion of total victory will not bring Israel, will not only bog down Israel and Gaza, drain the economic, military, and human resources, and further Israel's isolation in the world. That will not bring hostages home. That will not bring an enduring defeat of Hamas. That will not bring Israel lasting security. I think that's actually sincere in the sense that they have this liberal Zionist vision of what Israel should be, and they don't agree with Netanyahu's vision. Their dispute with Netanyahu and the Israeli far right is how to preserve Israel as a Jewish supremacist state. The Netanyahu view and the right-wing view is through murder, through destruction, through killing. And the Biden view is, yes, murder, destruction, and killing up to a point, but ultimately Israel has to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of the world through a two-state solution, through giving Palestinians a little statelet that is demilitarized, that is run by a puppet ruler like the other Arab states in the region. And that's your path to legitimacy and security. That's where the disagreement is. It's how to preserve Israel as a racist Jewish state. And the Biden view is, which is the same view as sort of the elites of the West, the liberal centrist elites of the West, is that to preserve Israel as a Jewish supremacist apartheid state, you need a Palestinian Bantustan. And the Netanyahu and Israeli view is, no, we don't. We can do what we like. We can murder them, we can bomb them, we can destroy them. So that's where the difference lies. It's not any sort of concern for Palestinians. And I think that to that extent, Biden does want a ceasefire. However, what he's not willing to do is what he can do to bring it about. He is the one person in the world who could pick up the phone and stop this thing with one phone call, because all he has to do is shut off the weapons supply from the Pentagon to Israel. With one phone call, he can do that to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, say, halt all shipments. That they're not willing to do, and that's why ultimately this is simply an exercise in trying to wash their hands of the blood which they have been Israel's full partners in spilling.
Now, you were talking earlier in our discussion about the realities of the military situation on the ground, and I do agree completely that Israel has been militarily defeated, first and foremost in Gaza. But I think having refrained from entering South Lebanon in any major way by way of land invasion after daily attacks multiple times a day for 7 months from Hezbollah shows a real, I think, unwillingness on the part of the Israeli military leadership to tackle that problem on the northern border as well. At some point, the military defeat will become so obvious that it can no longer be denied. Even the Israeli public, I think, is beginning to wake up to the reality of the situation. What do you think? And I know it's a bit unfair. I'm asking you to get out your crystal ball and give us your best prediction. What do you think happens then? Clearly, the world has changed. Israel, it seems, cannot go back to being what it was, not simply reputationally, but economically, for example. And the deterrence that it was able to wield in the past has been eviscerated, vis-a-vis its adversaries in West Asia. So what do you think happens next?
I think there's a shorter term and a longer term answer to that. In the short term, the significance of Israel's military defeat in Gaza is, I think that's ironically one of the things that is holding up the ceasefire, because Israel, the terms which the resistance is demanding, which are very reasonable and the minimum, frankly, that anyone can accept, which is a permanent end to the genocide and the war, full Israeli withdrawal, allowing people to return home, reconstruction and a prisoner exchange, and an end to the siege of Gaza. Those are the bare minimum requirements for life in Gaza. Israel has said that if we agree to that, it's a defeat. But Israel is the defeated party militarily, and they cannot impose their will. They cannot impose their will through negotiations that they didn't achieve on the battlefield, so to speak. And so they're not willing to accept their own defeat. And the Americans aren't willing to accept their defeat publicly. They're trying to spin this as not an Israeli defeat. Because remember, at the beginning, they were saying a permanent ceasefire. They were saying it openly. American officials were saying a ceasefire means Hamas won. They said that at the beginning. They defined the terms. So now if they agree to a permanent ceasefire, it means Hamas won. So they just keep it going. They keep the negotiations going. They keep the slaughter going because they don't want to admit that defeat. Now, admitting defeat, which everyone can see anyway in the region, has profound consequences, because we grew up with an idea of Israel that Israel was invincible, that Israel was a superpower. It could do anything. That even when it didn't, even when it had relative failures like the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, still, there was no constellation of military forces that could defeat Israel in the region. And simply nobody believes that now. Israel looks like a weak country. Even in the recent episode with Iran, announcing days in advance, if not weeks, we're going to retaliate. And then, hey guys, the missiles are on their way. Just so you know, the drones and the missiles are on their way now. Israel still was incapable of defending itself. It had to, the US had to pull out all the stops along with its regional clients and allies to try to defend Israel against the most heavily trailed and announced retaliation in history of retaliations by Iran. And so this is an Israel that has always relied on the notion of its invincibility, its cruelty, its unpredictability to keep everyone in check. And now this is a country that looks weak. It looks like it's unraveling. Its leaders are fighting with each other. Its society is really deeply divided. There is sort of all but a civil war there in terms of the depth of the divisions and the hatreds among the Israeli Jewish population. And economically, we interviewed at the Electronic Intifada podcast, hopefully by the time people are watching this, it will be up on our YouTube channel, but it will be very soon. If not, Shir Hever, an economic analyst and researcher with the BDS movement, who goes through in that interview just the collapse of investment into Israel, the capital flight, the number of people leaving, the number of people applying for second passports. And by the way, this phenomenon didn't start after October 7th. It began before, in the context, if you remember, the protests against the judicial reforms and so on, and people saying Israel no longer has rule of law, it's no longer a safe place for investments. Of course, we know that Israel's weapon industry and espionage and surveillance industry, which is massive, a huge export earner for Israel, billions of dollars every year, a huge part of its GDP relative to its size, was also based on the notion of an Israel that is very sophisticated, that knows how to do things no one else knows how to do militarily, in terms of surveillance, in terms of signals intelligence, and so on. And October 7th just completely destroyed that image. So perhaps in the short term, Israel is still going to sell some weapons, but people are going to look at it and say, well, what do you really know? You didn't see October 7th coming. On October 7th, your army was defeated. They were dragged out of the barracks by the Hamas fighters. And since October 7th, they've been total murderous, genocidal clowns. Yes, we know they're really good at murdering babies, but you know what they're not good at doing? Fighting in tunnels, fighting the resistance, finding the resistance, stopping the resistance in any way, shape, or form, degrading its capabilities. They're great at doing TikTok videos of themselves, blowing up mosques, destroying universities, trying on the underwear of women they may just have murdered, Palestinian women, and so on. But they're not good fighters. So everything is destroyed. And we've spoken to Israelis or people who grew up there. They may or may not still call themselves Israelis. I don't want to speak to them for them. People like Ilan Pape, the historian, and Shir Hever, whose interview I hope people will find and watch. Again, if it's not up when they're watching this, it will be, very soon. Who is saying that the whole thing is unraveling, that it has no future. And Shir Hever said that, in the modern period at least, states that commit genocide, regimes that commit genocide, don't survive, they collapse. And I do think that is the long term here. I think you'll find that for all the horror Palestinians are living through, the unspeakable heartache, just the suffering on levels that we have never witnessed in our lifetimes, and that people who survived the Nakba tell us is worse than 1948. My father was a child during the Nakba, but remembers it, and he says this is worse than anything we lived through, for all the horrors they lived through. Not to minimize what they went through in 1948, but this is far worse. But for all that, you find among Palestinians a certain high morale and a certain conviction that history is moving in the right direction and this regime will fall. And I think it may fall more with a whimper than a bang, in the sense that it is a loss of confidence. A loss of confidence among its own population and among its supporters in the world, and that eventually the plug will be pulled. Now, to go back to Ukraine for a second, it's been clear. It was very clear to a few of us, and I can't claim any great expertise, but I could spot the good analysis early on that Ukraine could never win a war against Russia, that was an absurd notion. And the people who were telling Ukraine they could and using Ukraine to pursue their ancient hatreds against Russia and their ancient grudge against Russia were doing so uh, at the expense of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives in a futile war and the destruction of Ukraine. The people who claim to love Ukraine and to care about Ukraine are the ones who sent Ukrainians to their deaths and who are still doing so, and who are now, as Ukraine's so-called supporters in the West, are the ones who are now saying, let's reduce the conscription age to 18 so that we can send Ukrainian kids to die, and so on. Or let's send Ukrainian refugees, male refugees, back and force them to join the army, and so on. Those are the people who claim to care about Ukraine. Now, it's clear to everyone, it must be clear, even to the delusional people in the White House or the Pentagon or NATO headquarters or the European Union headquarters or the Reichstag in Berlin, which is, by the way, still what the building is called where the German parliament is. It should be clear to them that Ukraine has lost the war. But as we see so often, instead of ending it, instead of pursuing a reasonable negotiated settlement, politically speaking, the cost of that, they perceive it to be too high. So they carry on. They drag it on. So with Ukraine, the goal appears to be just to keep it, just to avoid a total Ukrainian collapse, at least through the US elections in November, because they want to avoid scenes of collapse of yet another client regime, as we saw with the chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan after the American defeat there, after 20 years of lying that they were winning the war against Taliban. So that's to say that don't underestimate their willingness to keep this going for as long as possible, just to avoid their own political embarrassment. Similar to Netanyahu, everyone understands that Netanyahu wants to keep the war going for his own personal survival, but that's no less true of the Bidens and of the other Western leaders. When I said, I'm not contradicting myself when I said I think Biden would sincerely like a ceasefire, but he wants it on Israeli terms. He doesn't want it on terms that serve Palestinians. But if they can't get it on Israeli terms, because again, they haven't defeated the resistance, so they can't dictate the terms, they're more than willing to keep it going to avoid a conclusion.
An interesting anecdote, Ali. I live on the southern coast of Greece, and I've got this old house up in a mountain outside of Kalamata, and I have a really crappy internet connection up there. So I got frustrated with my connection. I couldn't fix it, and I started looking for apartments in the center of Kalamata. And I discovered that a number of the listings were in Greek and Hebrew. And so when I went to see one of these apartments, I asked the real estate agent. He said, yes, there has been quite an upsurge in demand for properties by purchasers from Israel. I also have a sister who lives in Cyprus, just near the Green Line. She has 4 children there, and she tells me they're seeing a similar phenomenon on the southern coast of Cyprus, a large influx. I don't. These are just anecdotes, and there's a lot more.
And they're anecdotes, but they're true, and I hear them from a lot of people. A lot of people who are observing these things. And to an extent, that's all we have, because Israel has been very, very secretive about any sorts of statistics that would give us a broader picture. But there's no secret that large numbers of Israelis are leaving, and they may call it temporary, but the lot of this very little to go back to. And, in the best case scenario, what Israeli leaders are promising Israelis is decades of endless war. That's the best case scenario.
Mm-hmm. The last question, because I know you have a busy day today. I want to come back to your book about the one-state solution, and this is related to what we've been talking about for the last few minutes. As you know all too well, as a person of Palestinian origin, spent so much time in the region, studied this struggle for your entire life. The Israeli population has been brainwashed to an absolutely extraordinary degree about the Palestinian people. They have been utterly demonized to such an extent that it's hard to imagine. I mean, the polls show that I think in excess of 90% of the Israeli Jewish population thinks that the Israeli military is either using an appropriate degree of force in Gaza or is not using enough force. That is the degree to which the Israeli Jewish population attaches little to no value to the lives of Palestinians. And if they find themselves, if the people in Israeli society who think this way, and there are a great many of them, find themselves in a situation where they feel incapable of dominating the indigenous Palestinian population, doesn't it seem that the most likely option that they will pursue is a departure from the country? Isn't this ultimately going to lead to use the biblical term, an exodus of large swaths of the Israeli Jewish population? And then ultimately the final defeat will be a demographic one, where the Palestinian population simply becomes so large vis-a-vis the Israeli Jewish population that it's no longer possible to exert any level of dominance over the Palestinian population, and it becomes Palestine. I mean, at least to me, that seems like one very possible long-term development. What do you view? What is your view about this? Do you think there is realistically possible that a majority of the Israeli Jewish population could learn to live in a one state as equals with the Palestinian people today?
This is a very good question and a difficult question. I think that ultimately, historically speaking, when settler colonies end, I mean, we can divide settler colonies into two broad categories: the successful ones from their perspective and the ones that failed. And the successful ones are the ones that committed near total genocide, not total genocide, but near total genocide. So we're talking about your Canadas, your United States, your New Zealands, your Australias, because they reduced the indigenous population to such a degree that it couldn't really present any serious challenge to the fact of the settler colonial state. And I say nearly genocide because we don't want to overlook the fact that indigenous resistance in all of these places has been constant and continues, and the indigenous struggle continues. But nonetheless, it is on a scale that really can't topple the state, at least not conceivably so, I would think. The failed settler colonies are the ones where the genocide is much less than what we see in the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So think about South Africa, you think about Northern Ireland, you think about Algeria, French Algeria. The settlers there, in Mozambique, also a Portuguese colony, and they ended in different ways. In Algeria, they left. The French settlers left. In Mozambique, the settlers left. In other colonies like Kenya, British colonies, the settlers mostly left. Few were left behind. In South Africa, most of them remained, but large numbers left at the end of apartheid. I think there are estimates like 1 million or so whites who went to Australia, Canada, the successful, so to speak, settler colonies. And the point, and Professor Joseph Messad of Columbia University makes this, is the thing that the settlers, by and large, cannot accept or tolerate is equality. Because in all those cases, the colonized people fighting the liberation struggle said to the colonists in one way or another, live with us equally. You can stay, but you'll have to be equal, no special privileges. And that's a deal the settlers will not accept. So they will go to places where their privileges are guaranteed. So for the settlers in Algeria, you go back to France. For the settlers in Mozambique, you go back to Portugal or wherever, and so on. So that's to put the Israelis in a bigger context, the Israeli Jews. They're not so remarkable. So to answer your question now, a large number will leave, and they're already leaving. That was already the case before October 7th. Israel had already lost the so-called demographic war. Palestinians are already once again a majority in historic Palestine. And in a sense, we see this is why Israel is so vicious, because it's a lost gasp to hold on to what they have. Now, faced with a similar crisis, the South Africans, the white South African supremacist regime, they looked at the situation. This would have been in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, and they would have said, we have the military power to destroy the ANC, to destroy any kind of military resistance. And that was true. In terms of physical force, the South African apartheid state had the force to just destroy everyone. But they looked at it and they said the political, the economic, the social cost for us of waging effectively a genocide within South Africa beyond what we've already done these previous how many centuries would be unbearable. We wouldn't be able to sustain it. And so they chose negotiation. They chose a negotiated solution that in fact ended up preserving many of their economic privileges and so on. The Israelis, looking at the same situation, said, yeah, let's do a genocide. And I think my miscalculation, and the miscalculation even some friends in Gaza, was not that we thought the Israelis weren't genocidal. It's that we thought we had some notion that, even this corrupt world will not allow them to go that far. And we were just simply wrong about that. I don't think it will save them in the end. I think that it will collapse. A large number of them will leave. Some will stay. Not all Israelis, because Israeli Jewish society is also a highly racialized society. Not all Israeli Jews have equal access to departure. Those who come from Europe or North America may already have second passports or may have easier access to second passports than those who came from Arab countries or from Africa or from Asia, and who maybe don't want to return to the countries they came from or can't return to them. And so they may be the ones who end up staying. And it just so happens that many of them came from Arab countries. There's this myth that they were all expelled. That's not the history. They weren't expelled. The Zionists worked to get them out of the Arab countries. But nonetheless, they came from Arab countries, from Iraq, Morocco, and they may return to more of an Arab culture and assimilate back into the region that they're actually from with the end of Zionism. Of course, we can't predict, but these are all possibilities that can happen. But yes, I think that the demographic, economic, social collapse is what will do Israel in more than a military invasion by some outside force. But of course, it is the resistance that is accelerating those trends within Israel, and Israel's utter failure to defeat and deter the resistance. And when we talk about that, of course, we're not talking just about the Palestinian resistance, but very significantly the resistance in Lebanon with Hezbollah, and now a regional resistance that we haven't seen on this scale and form in many, many years, where Yemen, the Iraqi resistance, and of course Iran as a state is participating in direct attacks or retaliation against Israel in a way that seemed inconceivable even a few years ago.
Indeed. Well, before we go, I just want to remind everybody about the extraordinary quality of the coverage over at Electronic Intifada of this genocide. It's not, I don't want to lead anybody to believe it's just about combat. covers all aspects of this extraordinary and terrible, terrible series of events that we're witnessing. So I cannot encourage you strongly enough, all of you, to watch Electronic Intifada in the days ahead. Thank you so much, Ali. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Dimitri.